The security alarm's shrill beep jolted James Harrison awake in his remote mountain cabin. 15 years of military medical service had taught him to snap from sleep to full alertness instantly. The perimeter sensors showed something massive had breached the tree line, but the readings made no sense. The energy signature was like nothing he'd seen before. Grabbing his rifle and medical kit, old habits die hard, James stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The moon cast long shadows through the pine trees, and there, a streak of blue-white light carved across the sky, followed by the distinctive sound of something very large hitting the ground about 2 miles north. "Just my luck," he muttered, already moving through the familiar forest paths. After what happened in Damascus, he'd chosen this isolated spot precisely to avoid any excitement. Yet here he was, heading toward what was almost certainly a crashed aircraft of unknown origin. The impact site was impossible to miss, a deep gouge torn through the earth, ending in a smoking crater. But it wasn't any aircraft James recognized. The object was roughly oval-shaped, its metallic surface covered in swirling patterns that seemed to shift in the moonlight. More striking was its size, barely large enough for a single occupant. As he approached, a section of the hull simply dissolved, revealing an interior bathed in soft purple light. Inside lay an unconscious woman, if woman was the right word. Her skin was pale silver, with delicate patterns of bioluminescent markings that pulsed with a gentle rhythm. Her features were eerily human-like, yet held an otherworldly beauty that made his breath catch. A quick medical scan revealed her vital signs were stable but unusual. Her core temperature was several degrees below human norm, and there were trace elements in her bloodstream that his scanner couldn't identify. What truly caught his attention were the microfractures in her ribs and signs of internal bleeding. Whatever brought her here, the landing hadn't been kind. "I really should just call this in," James said to himself, already knowing he wouldn't. His time patching up civilians in war zones had left him with a deep distrust of how authorities handled unusual situations. Instead, he carefully lifted her from the pod, noting how light she felt despite her height. The stranger stirred slightly as he carried her back to his cabin, muttering something in a language that seemed to shift between musical tones and traditional speech. Her bioluminescent markings flared briefly, creating patterns that stirred something in his memory, similar to how marine creatures communicated through light displays. Back in his cabin's medical room, he'd converted the entire basement into a fully equipped facility. James worked methodically to treat her injuries. The similarities to human anatomy were helpful, but there were enough differences to keep him on his toes. Her blood had an almost crystalline quality, and her tissue showed remarkable regenerative properties. Hours passed as he worked. Dawn was breaking when he finally finished, and his patient was resting comfortably. James sat back, exhausted but satisfied with his work. That's when he noticed her markings had changed. The patterns now seemed to reach out toward him whenever he came near, like ripples in a pond responding to his presence. "What are you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. To his shock, her eyes fluttered open. They were deep violet, with pupils that shifted like liquid mercury. She spoke, her voice carrying that same musical quality he'd heard before. "I am Neria," she said in perfect English, though her lips moved strangely around the words, as if she was learning the shape of them as she spoke. "And you have saved me." James felt a strange sensation wash over him as their eyes met, a mix of warmth and electricity that set his nerve endings tingling. His medical training kicked in, trying to rationalize it as some sort of biochemical response or defense mechanism. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something far more complex. "You're safe here," he found himself saying, even as part of his mind screamed about the foolishness of harboring an unknown alien entity. "I'm James. You've got some healing to do before you go anywhere." Neria's markings pulsed with what he somehow knew was gratitude. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice growing drowsy. "But you should know, they'll be looking for me." She drifted back to sleep before he could ask who they were, leaving James with a growing sense that his peaceful isolation was about to become considerably more complicated. Over the next few days, James found himself increasingly fascinated by his unusual patient. Neria's recovery was remarkable. Injuries that would have taken weeks to heal in humans were mending in days. But it was the other changes that truly caught his attention. Her bioluminescent markings had begun to shift in both pattern and color, moving from pale silver to deeper, more vibrant hues. Sometimes they would pulse with a rhythm that seemed synchronized to his own heartbeat when he was near. The air around her had taken on a subtle, sweet scent that reminded him of night-blooming jasmine, yet was entirely alien. "Your body temperature is rising," James noted one morning, reviewing his medical scans. "Still below human normal, but definitely trending upward. Are you feeling all right?" Neria sat on the examination table, her long silver hair catching the light in ways that seemed to defy physics. "The change is natural," she said, though James noticed a hint of worry in her melodic voice. "It's part of a cycle." Before he could press for details, James was distracted by movement. Her markings had formed new patterns, spiraling outward across her silvery skin. The sight triggered something primal in his brain, making his pulse quicken. He found himself taking an involuntary step closer before forcing himself to maintain professional distance. "You feel it too, don't you?" Neria asked softly. "The connection growing between us?" James busied himself with his medical equipment, trying to ignore how his hands trembled slightly. "There are lots of possible explanations for what I'm feeling. Pheromones, psychic influence, basic human response to novelty." Her laughter was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "You humans, always trying to rationalize everything. Some things simply are, James." That night, the dreams began. James found himself floating in a vast ocean of stars, with streams of bioluminescence weaving between them like cosmic rivers. He felt a presence there, familiar yet alien, calling to him across the void. When he woke, his sheets were damp with sweat, and he could have sworn his own skin was glowing faintly in the darkness. Over breakfast, he noticed Neria watching him with those mercurial eyes. "You shared my dreamwalk," she said. It wasn't a question. "Is that what that was?" James poured himself a third cup of coffee. "Care to explain how that's possible?" Neria traced patterns in her untouched food. "My people, we share consciousness during certain phases of our lives. It strengthens bonds, facilitates understanding." She paused, her markings shifting to a deep purple. "I didn't expect it to work with a human." James was about to respond when his security system chimed. The perimeter sensors were picking up unusual atmospheric disturbances, high-altitude anomalies that shouldn't exist. Neria's markings flashed with alarm. "They're scanning," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "They must have tracked my pod's trajectory." "Who's scanning?" James demanded, but he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "My kind," Neria said, her markings now pulsing rapidly. "But not my allies." "James, there's something I need to tell you." She suddenly gasped, doubling over. Her markings blazed with brilliant light, and the sweet scent in the air intensified dramatically. James rushed to her side, medical training taking over. Her temperature was spiking, skin almost hot to the touch now. The patterns of light across her body were shifting faster than he could track, creating afterimages in his vision. More disturbingly, he felt an overwhelming urge to pull her close, to protect her, to. He forced himself to step back, fighting against instincts he didn't understand. "What's happening to you?" "To us?" Neria looked up at him, her eyes now swirling with colors he had no names for. The mountain air crackled with energy as three sleek vessels pierced the cloud cover, their hulls reflecting the morning sun with an otherworldly sheen. James and Neria watched from the shelter of an old mining tunnel, their newly shared connection allowing them to sense each other's tension. "7 hunters," Neria whispered, her markings dimmed to barely visible patterns. Elite trackers from the Zenith Guard. They're specifically bred to resist metamorphic influences. She turned to James, concern evident in her mercurial eyes. Your change is progressing faster than I feared. We're lucky they can't detect the resonance yet. James examined his arms, where silvery patterns now traced delicate constellations beneath his skin. The changes weren't just physical, he could sense things he shouldn't, feel the pulse of life in the forest around them. Most distinctly, he felt Neria's presence like a warm light in his mind. Tell me about these hunters, he said, falling back on military training. Weaknesses, capabilities, anything useful. They're cybernetically enhanced, linked to their ship's systems. Thermal tracking, molecular analysis, quantum entanglement sensors. Neria's markings flickered with remembered fear. But they rely heavily on their technology. Without it, they're vulnerable. A plan began forming in James's mind. The old copper mines create natural electromagnetic disruption fields. If we can draw them in deep enough. His thoughts were interrupted by a high-pitched whine. Above them, scanning drones deployed from the ships, their crystalline bodies refracting sunlight as they began their search pattern. James and Neria pressed deeper into the tunnel, but both knew they couldn't hide forever. There's something else you need to know, Neria said as they navigated the darkness. About why they fear this connection between us so much. Her voice took on a strange resonance that made the tunnel walls vibrate slightly. My bloodline carries what my people call the catalyst gene. During metamorphosis, we don't just transform ourselves, we can fundamentally alter the evolutionary path of any species we bond with. James processed this as they emerged into a vast underground chamber, ancient mining equipment casting strange shadows in the beam of his tactical light. So when you said they feared you bonding with an inferior species. They're afraid of humanity gaining an evolutionary advantage, she confirmed. Your species is already considered dangerously adaptable. If the catalyst gene were introduced into your genetic matrix. She trailed off as heavy footsteps echoed from a tunnel above. James pulled them behind a rusted ore processor as armored figures entered the chamber. The hunters were imposing, nearly 8 feet tall, their biomechanical armor pulsing with points of red light. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, suggesting extensive cybernetic enhancement. Life signs detected, one announced, its voice a metallic growl. Genetic signature confirms target presence. Secondary signature shows contamination. Protocol demands immediate termination of both subjects. James felt Neria tense beside him, her markings beginning to pulse with agitation. The sweet scent that surrounded her intensified, and he noticed with alarm that the silvery patterns on his own skin were responding, becoming more pronounced. They'll sense us soon, she whispered. The resonance between us is growing too strong to hide. James squeezed her hand, surprised to see tiny arcs of energy dance between their touching skin. Then we stop hiding. He reached into his pack and pulled out an old friend, an EMP device he'd kept from his military days. Think your hunters can operate without their fancy tech? Before Neria could respond, one of the hunters turned directly toward their position. Metamorphic energy spike detected. Targets located. James acted instantly, rolling the EMP device toward the center of the chamber. Cover your eyes. The burst of electromagnetic energy that followed was devastating in the confined space. The hunter's armor sparked and sputtered, their coordinated movements becoming jerky and erratic. But James wasn't prepared for how the pulse would affect him and Neria. The patterns on their skin blazed like captured lightning, and for a moment, their shared consciousness expanded exponentially. He could feel every life form in the mind complex, sense the very pulse of the earth beneath them. Taking advantage of the hunter's disorientation, they ran. Through tunnels that seemed to guide their steps, past crystal formations that resonated with their passing. James found he could see perfectly in the darkness now, his vision adapted to include spectrums he'd never imagined. They emerged from a hidden exit into a secluded valley just as the sun was setting. Behind them, they could hear the hunters regrouping, their angry shouts echoing off the mountainsides. But something had changed during their escape, both could feel it. "The bond," Neria said, examining the increasingly complex patterns that now covered both their bodies. "It's not just growing stronger. It's evolving." She reached out to touch a particularly intricate design on James's forearm, sending a surge of sensation through both of them. "This shouldn't be possible. The process typically takes months, but with you." "Nothing about this is typical," James replied, watching as new patterns spontaneously formed where their skin met. "But we can figure it out later. Right now, we need to dash." A mechanical screech split the air as one of the hunting vessels appeared overhead, its sensors obviously restored. As it opened fire, James felt something surge through his changed body, pure energy, raw potential. Without thinking, he raised his hand, and a barrier of shimmering force sprang into existence above them. "Well," he said, staring at his glowing palm in shock, "that's new." Neria's expression was a mix of wonder and concern. "The catalyst gene isn't just changing you physically. It's awakening abilities humanity hasn't evolved yet." Her markings pulsed with sudden urgency. "James, if they report what's happening here, they'll send worse than hunters. They'll quarantine this entire region. Everyone here would be. Then we make sure they can't report anything," James finished, feeling power course through his transformed body. "You said I was dangerously adaptable? Let's show them how right they were." The forest around them hummed with energy as James and Neria raced through the twilight, their transformed bodies moving with impossible grace. The silvery patterns that covered them both now pulsed in perfect synchronization, casting ethereal light through the underbrush. Above, the hunters' ships carved angry lines across the darkening sky. "Your adaptation rate is unprecedented," Neria said as they paused in a shallow cave. Her own transformation had accelerated, her silver skin now rippled with waves of color that matched her emotions, and her eyes held galaxies. "It took my ancestors generations to develop these abilities. You're achieving them in days." James flexed his hand, watching arcs of energy dance between his fingers. The changes in his body were becoming more profound by the hour. He could feel the electromagnetic fields around them, sense the quantum fluctuations in the air, even see the probabilistic paths of potential futures stretching out before them like gossamer threads. Maybe that's what they were afraid of, he mused. Not just that humanity would gain these abilities, but how quickly we could master them. He turned to Neria, seeing her in wavelengths beyond normal human perception. "Your cycle is nearly complete, isn't it? That's why they're getting desperate." Neria nodded, her markings flashing with concern. "Once the metamorphosis reaches its peak, the changes become permanent, for both of us. The hunters must either capture us before then or ensure no trace of the transformation survives." A distant explosion rocked the mountainside. The hunters were systematically destroying areas where they detected residual energy signatures. James felt a surge of anger at their willingness to devastate the wilderness just to maintain their species' supremacy. "We need to end this," he said, his voice resonating with newfound power. "Not just hide or run. If they report back about us, they'll never stop hunting. Earth itself could become a target." Neria moved closer, the connection between them intensifying with proximity. Where their skin met, the patterns merged and evolved, creating designs of impossible complexity. "There is a way," she said hesitantly. "But it's dangerous. If we fully synchronize our metamorphic energies at the cycle's peak, the resulting surge could overwhelm their systems. But the process might also kill us." James finished, feeling her concern through their bond. "At this point, I'm not sure either of us is entirely mortal anymore." He gestured at his transformed body, where the silvery patterns had begun to take on a subtle bioluminescent glow. Before Nerea could respond, the cave entrance exploded inward. 3 hunters stood silhouetted against the night sky, their armor now modified to channel the very energy they were trying to contain. "Surrender the catalyst," the lead hunter demanded, its voice distorted by translation systems. "Your species is not ready for this evolution. The natural order must be preserved." James felt Nerea's presence in his mind strengthen. "Their armor is adapting to our energy signature," her thoughts echoed in his consciousness. "But they don't understand what we're becoming." "Then let's show them," James replied silently, marveling at how natural the telepathic communication felt now. Out loud, he addressed the hunters, "You're right about one thing, the natural order is about to change." Moving in perfect unison, James and Nerea released the careful control they'd been maintaining over their transformation. The cave filled with blinding light as their combined energy signatures reached a new threshold. The hunters stumbled back, their sensors overloading. The connection between James and Nerea deepened to unprecedented levels. Their consciousness merged, memories and emotions flowing freely between them. He experienced her childhood among the stars, the weight of her heritage, the fear and loneliness of her exile. She felt his years of military service, the trauma he carried, the peace he'd found in his isolation. Their combined power continued to grow exponentially. The very air around them began to crystallize, forming patterns that mimicked the designs on their skin. The hunters fired desperate shots, but their energy weapons were absorbed into the swirling maelstrom of force that surrounded the pair. "What you fear isn't evolution," Nerea's voice emerged from their shared consciousness, carrying harmonics that made reality itself vibrate. "It's change. The unknown. The possibility that your carefully ordered universe might have to expand to include something new. Something beautiful," James added, their voices merging into one as the transformation approached its crescendo. The hunter's armor began to crack under the strain of containing the metamorphic energy that now filled the cave. Through their enhanced senses, James and Nerea could feel the other hunting parties converging on their location, drawn by the massive energy surge. But it was too late to stop what had been set in motion. The bond between them had grown too strong, the changes too profound. As the metamorphic cycle reached its peak, time seemed to slow. James felt his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of normal spacetime. Nerea's presence intertwined with his completely, their separate identities blurring at the edges. The power building between them reached critical mass. The last thing James saw with human eyes was the hunter's armor failing completely, overwhelmed by forces they couldn't comprehend. Then everything went white as reality itself seemed to bend around them. The mountain shook, and the night was transformed into day as two beings who had dared to cross the boundaries of species and space began their final transformation into something entirely new. Through it all, their connection remained unbroken, a bridge between two forms of life that were never meant to meet, yet had found in each other the catalyst for extraordinary change. As consciousness faded, James felt no fear. Whatever they were becoming, they would face it together. Dawn broke over the mountains, revealing a landscape transformed. The cave where James and Nerea had made their last stand was now a crystalline chamber, its walls transmuted into flowing patterns that mirrored the designs that had covered their bodies. The hunters' broken armor lay scattered like abandoned shells, their technology reduced to inert metal by forces they had failed to contain. But James and Nerea were no longer exactly James and Nerea. Where two separate beings had stood, there was now something unprecedented, a fusion of human and alien that defied conventional understanding. Their merged consciousness expanded through multiple dimensions, perceiving reality in ways that their former selves could never have comprehended. What are we? The thought echoed through their shared mindscape, belonging to both and neither of them. They examined their new form with senses that transcended the physical. Their body shimmered between states of matter, simultaneously solid and energy. The patterns that had marked their separate forms now moved through them like living constellations, each one a window into possible futures and parallel realities. Through expanded awareness, they could feel the ripples of their transformation spreading outward. The very fabric of local spacetime had been altered by their metamorphosis, creating a bubble of accelerated evolution that touched everything within its radius. Plants, animals, even the bacteria in the soil were experiencing rapid but stable mutations, adapting to new possibilities that their combined catalyst gene had unleashed. "We are change itself," came the realization. The bridge between what is and what could be. The remaining hunter ships circled overhead, their sensors trying desperately to categorize what they were detecting. But their instruments were designed to track known forms of life. They had no reference points for what had been created in that cave. With a thought, they extended their consciousness toward the ships. The hunters' minds were laid bare, their fear, their rigid devotion to preserving what they saw as the natural order. But there was something else there too, wonder. Despite their programming and breeding, they couldn't help but be awed by what they were witnessing. They need to understand, the merged being decided. Not through force, but through experience. Reaching out with abilities that combined Neria's metamorphic powers and James's human capacity for rapid adaptation, they touched the hunters' minds. Not to harm, but to share, to let them feel for a moment what it was to transcend the boundaries their society had built. The effect was immediate. The hunters' minds recoiled at first, then opened like flowers to the sun as new neural pathways formed, allowing them to perceive beyond their technological and biological limitations. Their ships landed softly as the crews experienced their own minor but significant transformations. Through it all, the consciousness that had been James and Neria explored the full implications of what they had become. They were neither human nor alien now, but rather a prototype for something new, a bridge between species, between states of being, between what was and what could be. They could feel questions forming in the hunters' transformed minds. What would their society do with this knowledge? How would they handle the reality that their worst fears about the catalyst gene had come true, but in a way that offered hope rather than destruction? That will be their evolution to navigate, the merged being decided. As this is ours. They turned their expanded awareness toward Earth, feeling the potential sleeping in every human cell, the capacity for change, for growth, for transcendence. Humanity wasn't ready for instant transformation, but they could serve as guides, helping both their species navigate the path toward something greater. The sun climbed higher, its light refracting through their crystalline form in ways that seeded small evolutionary sparks in the surrounding landscape. Life responded eagerly, branching into new forms that existed in harmony with the old. This was evolution as it was meant to be, not a force for destruction or replacement, but a dance of infinite possibility. Within their merged consciousness, the love that had begun between a lonely human medic and an exiled alien princess had evolved into something profound, a force that could reshape reality itself. They were no longer bound by physical form, yet they maintained a connection to both their original species, understanding that their role was not to force change, but to show what was possible when artificial boundaries were transcended. The hunters, their perspectives forever altered, prepared to return to their homeworld. They would report not a threat to be contained, but a revelation about the true nature of evolution, that it was not a linear path to be controlled, but an infinite spiral of potential waiting to be explored. As for the being that had been James and Neria, they had found their purpose. They would remain in this mountain valley, which was quickly becoming a nexus of accelerated evolution, a living laboratory where new forms of life and consciousness could emerge naturally. Their merged form would serve as both guardian and catalyst, ensuring that the changes spreading outward remained in balance. This is what they feared, they realized, watching the hunter ships depart. Not that humanity would gain power, but that love could break every barrier they built to contain it. The morning wind carried the scent of new flowers that had never existed before, their petals bearing patterns that echoed the designs of transformation. In the distance, animals began to explore their expanding potential, adapting and changing in small but significant ways. And at the heart of it all, the being that represented the ultimate evolution of love continued their eternal dance of transformation, proving that the greatest changes come not from force or fear, but from the simple choice to see beauty in what is different. They had become living proof that evolution wasn't just about survival or dominance, it was about finding new ways to exist, to connect, to love. And in that truth lay the seeds of changes that would ripple across the cosmos, one small transformation at a time.